I'm Wayne Tuttle, and welcome to Chasing Legends. Good afternoon, this is Wayne Tuttle of Legend of the Superstition Mountains, and today I'm showing you our new line of t-shirts with these two guys. Go into represent.com/Legend of the Superstition Mountains and you can end up as cool as these guys. So pick them up, $24.99. Thank you. Welcome back to Chasing Legends. I'm Wayne Tuttle and I'm your host this week, as with most weeks. This week we're going to do one that we did previously, talking about Adolph Ruth, and unfortunately I believe either the footage or the audio or something was wrong and we were unable to use it, or something happened with equipment, technical things, and we don't want to put out stuff that's half-assed or not quite finished, so we will be catching that up today. A bit of an abbreviated version, taken generally from works of the Bark Notes, Helen Corbin, Thomas Glover, and we'll kind of cover like I said, the meat and potatoes of the story a bit, and some of my thoughts and opinions on it, and what I've learned and know over the years. Anyone that's interested, this is a U.S. Springfield 1884 model, 4570. So, pretty powerful gun. Obviously, there's copper wire holding that stock together still, but this rifle's been around for quite a long time and still actually in fireable and serviceable condition here. So getting into Adolph Ruth is probably one of the more well-known stories. It's probably the biggest file among my files because there's so much information. There was so much news reporting and other information given to it. The story begins Adolph Ruth's son Erwin was down in Mexico vaccinating cattle and overseeing some project on that. There was a rebellion and an overthrow. We won't get into the details because it's out there so many places, but Erwin went to do a favor to help an individual he'd met, a man by the name of Gonzalez, in getting his family to safety when the government was being overthrown and there was some sort of coup happening. While he couldn't save Gonzalez in the end on this story, Gonzalez made sure there was a number of maps and things that had belonged to the family for quite a few years that he put in, and he wanted Erwin to have. He knew Erwin's father, Adolph, was a bit of a cartographer and interested in maps and treasure maps and different things like that, so he had those passed along. This led Adolph and Erwin to the Borrego Desert and that whole thing where Ruth broke his hip and went through all that and had to be rescued and saved. But it was sometime after this all occurred that there were some maps that Adolph couldn't place. They weren't in California. He couldn't quite place them, several maps. So he had Erwin inquire with the family, and the family let him know that those weren't maps for the Gonzalez family or the Borrego Mountains. Those were maps, some mines that their cousins, the Peraltas, had in the Superstition Mountains in Arizona. So with that information, then Adolph got very interested in that, looking over the maps and so forth, and he thought he kind of had things kind of figured out. He made a trip out here, stayed with a gentleman by the name of Cal Morse, and kind of got his feet kind of on the ground a little bit, but it wasn't until in the 1930s he finally was able to come out. Erwin was unable to make the trip. Adolph had a young man work with him driving out, share the driving duties. He got out. Adolph stayed with Cal Morse for some time and was looking to get into the Superstition Mountains. Now, this is pretty much the factual record. If you read Barry Storm's Thunder God's Gold, has some of the information in it too as well. You have to usually take several sources to get the true story and picture. Even with the newspapers, there's a lot of stuff that's a little bit off. Adolph was wanting to get in the mountains, spring's coming. Whoever he was trying to get, including Tex Barkley, didn't want to take him in, didn't believe he belonged out there. He was an elderly man, he was handicapped. He wasn't a desert rat, so to speak of. So they delayed him. Finally, two men, Keenan and Purnell agreed to packed him in, and brought him back into the mountains and set up a camp for him and left him there. One of them went back to check on Ruth, noticed Ruth wasn't in camp, didn't see any sign of him, waited around for him, came back out, notified the authorities. Somewhere in this translation also Barkley heard that they had been to the camp, so he went back in, he checked as well. He looked around, tried to search around for Ruth to see if he was anywhere in the area, couldn't find him, came back in and alerted the authorities as well. Now you have to remember, in these areas you have the county lines of Maricopa County and Pinal County to the south, so it's very likely that both of them went in to look, and then both of them called the respective sheriff's departments to go out and start the search for Ruth. Now, Ruth was supposed to be in West Boulder Canyon, possibly. It's hard to say exactly where Ruth is. The newspaper accounts, I've actually looked at some of the accounting, and the odd thing I always found was their search pattern was more in the area of Weaver's Needle, East Boulder Canyon, and those areas than it actually was in the area his camp was. So they were figuring he was somewhere in this other area. While people say that's where he thought he had to travel to, it was very hot, it was summertime. It seems, especially with a man with a pronounced limp who didn't walk very well, regardless, I mean, he even said in one of his diary entries that riding the horse in just to the camp pretty much wore him out for a day. So they went out to look for him, they looked, they finally have to call off the search in the summer. Gus Barkley and Jeff Adams went out time and time again with some dogs, and they were packing in water and spending days, if not a week, searching for him. Finally, everybody just gave up. Adams and Barkley were the last two that repeatedly were searching for them. What came along was suddenly December that same year, a group, I believe Brownie Holmes was part of that group, and some newspaper guys and all. They were going to take a trip through the mountains at a number of archaeological ruins, Native American ruins, and different spots in the mountains for a series of newspaper articles. So they kind of loaded up the pack train, went out, and the stories are there. You can read all those stories. I think someone in the Old Lost Dutchman forum has a link where you can read all these newspaper articles, and they're interesting because it just pretty much rained and was raining out and just making everything but miserable for these guys. They're having all kinds of associated problems and stuff. So they're working their way through the mountains, and as they come across Bull Pass and start to run down through Marsh Valley back in the mountains, Music, one of the hounds, runs off to the side and starts barking and stuff, and Brownie Holmes works his way over to see what the dog's got, what's going on, what he's going off on. And there's a skull sitting under this Palo Verde tree. And they come up, and there's several pictures that are well known of Brownie posing next to it and Brownie holding it. It's hard to say if there was any actual real initial snapshot before the skull was moved. But they're newspaper guys, so they're going to make sure they get the right shot. They actually took the skull and took it with them to their next camp. There's a description in the article of the skull hanging from some wire or something from a tree as they were cooking dinner and so forth. The weather continued to grow bad. There was a bit of a discussion of whether it was possibly like a Solano Hokum skull or if it was something more modern. There was the discussion that there was still flies buzzing about it. It was still somewhat fresh. So the guys decided they'd come back into town. They brought it back in. The jaw was missing, but it was decided at that point it was probably that of Adolph Ruth. Looking at it where it was in the area, they started going out on more searches. I think the first initial search, again, Gus Barkley and Jeff Adams go out, and what happens is Jeff Adams got the flu or something, and they had to stop, come back out of the mountains, and go back out. This was an operation that was between, there was Jeff Adams working with Maricopa County Sheriff's Department. I know there was a deputy from the Pinal County Sheriff's Department with them, and Gabriel Robles was with them as well. So you had this team of group. I believe it was Gabriel Robles who actually was located some bones. They were by Blacktop Mesa. He'd noticed a bit of drainage down low. He called the others over after he started following up and finding more and more bones. He worked his way up, and they found primarily most of the remains, minus obviously the skull and a lot of smaller scattered bones that had come down the wash. All his effects, for the most part, pieces of his clothing, his eyeglasses, everything else. There was notes on him and so forth like that. So the remainder of his thermos was there. And there are pictures, graphic. His pistol was there. So all his remains, all his equipment was there with him that he'd had with him when he'd been there. The sheriff, McFadden, came in and they took some more photos and stuff. They bagged up everything. And there's a lot of different stories about what happened at that given moment in time. But the meat and potatoes of there is they located the body, and that's where the discrepancy comes. A lot of people say Adolph Ruth spoke too much, told too many people what he was doing. Personally, I think he was an elderly man. He was out there in the summertime. The heat was up. He probably went out. It could have been heat stroke. It could have been a heart attack. It could have been such a number of things. He could have gotten faint, passed out, fell, hit his head, not been able to recover. But I always personally felt that way. I was not always sure of the gunshot wound, and while everybody's an expert on gunshot wounds, the medical examiner from Maricopa County who looked at the skull and examined the remains said it was natural causes. The indentations, the breaks in the skull were from the skull being bashed into rocks. All the both sides of the wound actually protruded inward on the skull. So if it would have been a gunshot, it would have went externally and blown up the back of the skull. So he said every sign on that was from animals and natural causes, and that should have been the end of it. But it was a good story. Erwin Ruth believed his father was murdered. A number of other people did. I think a number of other people, words were put in their mouth over the years on the stories. And I know personally several people, some of who are not with us, were very adamant that it was just an accidental death. Keenan Purnell, they investigated them, never came up with anything. There were people pointed at Gus Barkley and his family, never could come up with anything. There were people that pointed at Brownie Holmes and said he had something to do with it. I think Barry Storm had a particular itch, something to grind with Brownie Holmes, and tried to implicate it. Brownie might have been the one. But Brownie Holmes himself even said he was a bit suspicious of who it could have been, but he knew where Gus Barkley was and other things, so he didn't think anyone else did it. He sure as heck didn't do it. So that is kind of the beginning and end of Adolph Ruth. Now, you can accept it. You can sit there and look at the photographs and say you're an expert at. I tend to go with the medical examiner. The other thing is, a lot of people have kind of made up a fictitious story of these files that were kept on file, because if it was a murder, if it was a homicide, it would have been listed as so, and if it was actually investigated, there would have been files and they would have been kept, because it would have been a cold case, but it wouldn't have been closed. The problem is the medical examiner is the person that decides where they're going to. There's no inquiry or murder investigation or homicide investigation if the medical examiner or the coroner labels it accidental death or natural causes, which is what's on the death certificate. So because of that, there actually wasn't an investigation into his death beyond that, other than speculation. So the people that say, oh, there was these files, oh, they were destroyed at this year, well, they wouldn't have ever been destroyed, so that's a lie. And there wouldn't have been files because it was never an active homicide investigation. There are still people that hold on. There was a Phoenix police detective that was involved, but he was actually looking at Keenan or Purnell, one of them, and he knew Erwin Ruth felt his father was murdered and was trying to get Erwin involved. What becomes interesting on that is Erwin, in letters with this detective, actually says he wasn't sure what maps they were. He wasn't familiar with the maps to begin with. So in the act of actively looking for what he thought was his father's murder, he still said he wasn't sure if he could represent which maps there were. There were 2 or 3. So when we always think of, oh, Adolph Ruth, there was 2 maps, there was 3 maps, there was this, there was that. There's a lot of murky water about that, and Erwin seemed sometimes to be very adamant. These are the maps that my father had. These are the copies of the maps that he gave to Glenn McGill. And then there's other times we can look at letters where he's personally, where he's got some time invested. He's not dealing with someone else. He's dealing with something very actively personal in nature. He's saying, I don't know if I know which maps they were. So it always leads us open to exactly which maps they were. A lot of people believe it's the profile map. It was one of the maps. We do know there was a geographical normal topo map, and that map had a lot of stuff written over it, and that they actually found that with Adolph Ruth, and it led them nowhere. And no one knows what became of that map, but that was probably the only recovered map at the time at the site. Irwin also later said that Adolph had been giving away his maps, so he wasn't sure which ones went where and what he quite had in the collection. As a post note to all this, Gene Reynolds, who I got to know a bit, and wrote a book. It's available on disc. I think there's actually a physical hard copy of it I've seen circulated. I actually have one. But Gene Reynolds' book, Brago 13 or Brago 9, whatever that one's called, excellent book. It's kind of a novel about his life in the search with this, his time with Glenn McGill and so forth. Talks about visiting the Ruth family, and a book called the Peralta book that said Peralta on it and so forth that everybody's been looking for. That might have been just privately produced by the Peralta family, but Gene had a lot of insight too of his own on this. So it's always worth investigating. A great murder mystery, not so murder mystery, depending how you want to take it. But yeah, it's the story that probably opened the floodgates for people in the 40s and 50s to come search for the Lost Dutchman mine. Definitely, even the worst possible scenario or narrative that happens is sometimes the best publicity. It opened up the whole possibility and everything of, tens and 20s of millions of dollars for tourism through Arizona. Second most popular spot to the Grand Canyon in the state of Arizona. So get out there, find some information, dig some stuff up. Don't always believe what you see on the internet. Those old things, they're in paper and bound, and they're called books. Those will actually pay off 10 times more. And ask questions. So until the next time, this is Wayne Tuttle and Chasing Legends, and enjoy yourself and have a good one.